Goodman. We just brought you our exclusive interview with former Guantanamo prisoner who was cleared to leave under both Presidents Bush and Obama, but remained at Guantanamo for over 12 years. His name, Jihad Abu al-Diab. He has never been charged with a crime. Well, last week, Democracy Now! Spoke to Ramzi Qasem, professor of law at City University of New York Law School. That's the CUNY Law School, where he directs the Immigrant and Non-Citizen Rights Clinic and has represented many Guantanamo prisoners. He's been to Guantanamo about 50 times, one of the lawyers who represented the 6 Guantanamo prisoners who the U.S. government released to Uruguay. I began by asking Ramzi Qasem to tell us about Diab's case, why he hasn't been able to see his family, what he's been asking for, what he was promised, and what the situation is overall at Guantanamo.
Yeah, so I'm among the people who negotiated. Obviously, there were U.S. government officials involved, Uruguayan government officials involved, and then on the defense lawyer side, I was one of those who partook in that negotiation, primarily on behalf of my client, Abdelhadi Faraj, who was another Syrian who was resettled in Uruguay, just like Diab. Ultimately, what happened was that 4 Syrians, 1 Palestinian, 1 Tunisian, all Guantanamo refugees were resettled in Uruguay. And, you know, I have to stress that the Uruguayan government's attitude towards these men was commendable. They viewed them and treated them as refugees under international law. They resisted, you know, the United States' insistence that their movement be restricted, that they be treated as something else, that they be placed under surveillance, for example. All of these things, according to public media reports, are standard when it comes to how the United States negotiates these repatriations or resettlements from Guantanamo. And to their credit, the Uruguayan government said, in large part because the rulers of Uruguay at the time, the president and his cabinet, were themselves former political prisoners.
President Mujica.
President Mujica had spent over a decade in prison under that very label as a terrorist in solitary confinement. So he understood, and the men in his cabinet understood what that meant. And so to their credit, they treated these men like refugees. And they said that they would allow them to reunite with their families in Uruguay, that they would facilitate family reunification. So all of the right things were said. Unfortunately, the problem was in the implementation. When the men arrived in Uruguay, you know, less preparation had been done than what we had expected and what we had hoped. And one of the main shortcomings is on this front: family reunification. In other words, you know, the government of Uruguay, with the help of the Red Cross, is offering families of men like Diab and men like my client to come from places like Syria or refugee camps in Turkey. But they're only offering temporary visits, and they're not giving the men the means to actually support those families in Uruguay. So the net result, and I'll tell you about the case that I know best, my client, Mr. Abdelhadi Faraj, his family is in war-torn Syria. He would love to see his parents. He hasn't seen them in 15 years. If he were to agree to have the Red Cross somehow try to bring them, make that very dangerous journey out of Syria and to Uruguay, he can only keep them there for a couple of weeks. His parents are elderly. They live in a very dangerous place. The trip itself would be life-threatening. So he doesn't want to subject them to that risk unless he has the ability to actually have them live with him in Uruguay. So that's where the shortcoming has been. No one, not the Uruguayan government, and certainly not the United States, has stepped up to make that happen. And I mentioned the United States because I think the Uruguayans have gone above and beyond the call in many ways, despite the shortcomings in preparation for the arrival of these men as refugees from Guantanamo. They have gone above and beyond the call. The lion's share of responsibility still rests with our country. It still rests with the United States. Our country is responsible for what happened to men like Diab. They're the ones, the United States took Diab and put him at Guantanamo and subjected him to torture there of different forms. And the United States is the one that...
And he was put at Bagram first.
And he was at Bagram first. And that's common. The majority of Guantanamo prisoners, or a large number of them at least, went through Bagram or other sites before arriving at Guantanamo. So the primary share of responsibility still rests with the United States. I believe that our country has a moral and historical duty to try to make these men whole. Other countries have. Canada has paid compensation. The United Kingdom has paid compensation. The United States has not accepted responsibility or compensated these men for what they have been through. And they continue to suffer for it, and their families continue to suffer. And Diab is just one example among many.
Diab was wanted to be at his daughter's wedding. I mean, he hasn't seen his children and his parents in between 15 and 20 years. Could he leave Uruguay? I mean, he actually attempted to. He went to Venezuela. He was taken by the secret police of Venezuela, and he was deported back to Uruguay. I mean, it's not a crime for him to leave Uruguay, but he was deported back. What can he do? I mean, he is just using the only thing he has, which is his body, to try to demand, by going on a hunger strike, which he did for so long at Guantanamo, to demand some kind of action. He says, if I'm free, why cannot I see my family?
And it's especially tragic that he's had to revert to that mode of communication, the mode of communication that he had when he was at Guantanamo. In other words, the only form of expression and protest available to many of the prisoners is to go on hunger strike, is to refuse food and sustenance from their captors. And that isn't a crime, right? It's a form of peaceful protest. And it is tragic that now that he's in Uruguay, supposedly a free man, he feels that he has no choice but to do that in order to be heard. Because, you know, he's been clamoring for a while. They've been in Uruguay for almost 2 years. And for that entire time, Mr. Diab and the other prisoners have been asking this question, you know, when are we going to see our families? Is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? The Uruguayans, when these men arrived, because they were considering them refugees, the Uruguayan government issued them what's called a cédula, which is basically a national ID card, which allows them to travel in certain countries in South America and in some countries in Central America, perhaps. So that's how Diab, earlier in his tenure in Uruguay, went to Argentina, for example, and gave a press conference there. And that's probably part of the explanation of how he eventually got to Venezuela and was then sent back to Uruguay. The rub is in that for him to go to Turkey, the Turkish government would have to acquiesce. Someone would have to facilitate that travel. He'd have to be issued travel papers, which obviously he's not going to get from the Syrian government, given what's going on in Syria right now. And ultimately, the United States government, whether or not they're going to publicly recognize it, my view, my opinion is that the United States government probably has a say as well. Now, still, the right thing to do here is to find some way to reunite Mr. Diab with his family. And it's either by bringing his family over from that refugee camp in Turkey to Uruguay in a sustainable fashion, where they can live with him in Uruguay and make a life for themselves there, or the other solution would be for him to go to Turkey and join his family there. It is it's compounding the injury that these men have suffered to keep them apart from their families after everything that they've been through. And again, this doesn't just hold for Mr. Diab. He is being vocal and brave in expressing his protest in that way. But I can tell you that my client, Mr. Faraj, who does not want to be in the media limelight, feels the same way. And the other prisoners that he's still in touch with in Uruguay, former Guantanamo prisoners, they feel the same way as well. And it's really, it shouldn't be shocking to anyone that these men, after all of these years, wish to see their families. Guantanamo is not a prison where families can visit. It's not like a facility here in the United States where there are visitation privileges and people can come over the weekend. These men have literally not seen their families for over a decade and a half.
Have some of the men seen their families brought to Uruguay and then they have to leave?
You know, I'm not familiar with the cases of all 6 of the Guantanamo refugees in Uruguay. I can tell you that for Mr. Diab, that hasn't happened, and I can tell you that for my client, Mr. Faraj, that has not happened for the reason that I explained earlier.
So you have been to Guantanamo for, what, like 50 times now, representing your clients. How many do you represent?
At this point, I have 3 clients remaining at Guantanamo. Over time, since 2005, I've represented over a dozen Guantanamo prisoners.
And that, what you added up to, what, being how much time at Guantanamo that you've spent?
Sadly, I did that math last time I was at Guantanamo a couple of months ago. It adds up to, I think, over a year at this point.
You've spent over a year at Guantanamo.
Yeah, which obviously pales in comparison to what my clients have spent, what they have gone through. But it was still shocking to me. I mean, if you had told me 10 years ago in 2006, when I made my first trip to Guantanamo, that a decade later I'd still be traveling there, I would have called you crazy.
President Obama just said once again he wants it closed by the end of his term. Do you think this will happen? What is happening at Guantanamo right now?
You know, President Obama, unfortunately, has been saying that since he was candidate Obama in 2007. You know, I agree with Mr. Diab on this. I believe that, unfortunately, our president has had that authority. He was elected, actually, on that basis. He had a mandate coming into office in 2009 to close that prison for political reasons, not policy reasons, but for political reasons. He chose not to make it a priority. He gave the opposition time to mobilize and make it more difficult for him. Still, despite those obstacles, ultimately he has the authority to close that prison. When President Bush opened Guantanamo on January 11, 2002, he didn't seek congressional approval. He just did it unilaterally as the President of the United States. President Obama could do the same. He is choosing not to do it. He's choosing not to take what he believes is a political risk.
To see the full interview with Ramzi Qasim, CUNY law professor, go to democracynow.org. Special